Chapter 20 The arrival of the Sea Raiders is one of the most mysterious parts of the time before the Imperial Confederation. The Micah kingdoms were completely destroyed at this time, while Rasharan and the Hentai Empire were greatly stressed. The pressure had a powerful effect on the two surviving empires, forcing them to change and evolve. Much of the Hentai dominance during the pre-Confederation era can be directly attributed to policies and traditions adopted during the time of the Sea Raiders. While there was a mix of other dangerous instabilities and problems that arose and were addressed around the same time, the Sea Raiders remain one of the only unexplained parts of those years. We know that before the knowledge of crop rotation took hold, the Hentai Empire had slowly declining crop yields over centuries. We know that the Micah, the Hentai, and Rasharan depended heavily on international trade, relying on each other for the copper and tin that made bronze, and that when that trade network was threatened they lost the ability to maintain tools and weapons. We know that their most powerful weapon, the chariot, was both expensive to maintain and hard to use by anyone but high-level charioteers, and that any significant loss of these soldiers would take decades to replace. We know that for millennia, magic was seen as dangerous and suspicious, mired in superstition and tradition instead of research and reason. However, we have almost no idea who the Sea Raiders were or where they came from. They hit the coasts like a storm, and like a storm departed shortly afterwards. An excerpt from The History of the Imperial Confederation, an analysis of pre-descent politics in the Near East by Karen Smith. Cadence Lee as Hammer Puff. I woke up on a bed, one with actual cushions. While that was admittedly nice, I wondered how I had gotten here. The sun was shining through an open window and the room looked rather nice. If it wasn't for the smell of smoke in the air, it would be quite a nice and peaceful morning. I jolted fully awake a second after I had that thought, the memories of yesterday flashing through my mind. The smoke in the sky, the ride to Agarit, watching Soot enter the city, and then singing on the hill. That reminded me of the pain in my throat and I flinched, raising a hand to my neck. I was glad that there was a pitcher of water by my bedside, because I was parched. The water was lukewarm and it hurt to drink it, but I still gulped it down greedily to slake my thirst. I could taste blood as I drank and nearly spilled a cup of water all over myself when Cyr surprised me with a hand on my shoulder. I hadn't heard her approach. For some reason she was whispering, asking how I was doing. I tried to respond but before I could make a sound I flinched from the pain again. Trying to speak was too painful, and I was starting to suspect that Cyr was not whispering to me. No, her mouth was far too animated for her to be whispering. I had gone deaf. Yesterday I pushed my skills to their limit like I never had before. I stood alone on the hill above Agarit because I, Cyr, and the royal guards assigned to me were unable to stand near me. I could feel my voice vibrating the ground beneath my feet as I sang to an entire city. My ears had hurt, then they bled. My voice would have cracked as the sound ravaged my throat if not for my perfect pitch skill. I tried to talk again, just to whisper, and the pain felt like a hot knife being shoved down my throat. It occurred to me that I might never be able to talk or hear correctly again because I had pushed my body far beyond what a human was supposed to be capable of. I tried to fight down the feelings of panic as tears began to fill my eyes. Cyr was saying something, but I couldn't understand what. Soon afterwards, a familiar pair of hands clutched my shoulders as Soot knelt by the bed, saying something with a concerned look on his face. I could only tap my ear and shake my head. He said something else and I could only open my mouth, point to it, and then shake my head again. Soot seemed to understand, because Cyr left and then came back with clay. Soot took the clay and a stylus from her and wrote, "Are you okay, Hem?" I took the clay from him and summoned my magic stylus, replying, "I am alive, but I cannot hear and it hurts to speak." I didn't write down my fears, but anyone could see that I had them and it was easy to understand what they were. When Soot took the clay gently from me, he wrote, "Do not worry, I will spare no expense to have priests and alchemists heal you, to reassure me. That might make me feel better later, but right now I was still devastated. Except, when I looked up, wiping the tears from my eyes, I was shocked to see that Suit was not in his customary robes. No, he was bare-chested. Or he would have been if not for the bandages. He had clearly been injured in the fighting. I instinctively tried to gasp in surprise, but only ended up flinching as I grabbed the clay back from him. "What about you, are you okay? You were injured." I wrote quickly, my handwriting suffering from my impatience. "They are just flesh wounds," was his reply, and I found out that attempting to laugh also hurt. After a few minutes of writhing in pain as I tried to laugh and cry out from the pain of trying to laugh at the same time, I managed to gain control of myself long enough to take the clay again and write out, "Don't make me laugh." Honestly, I didn't even find that part very funny, but the relief coursing through me had made me want to laugh uproariously. I had Suit write out an explanation of what had happened in the city after he had gone in, and how I had gotten into this bed. Having only the clay to write on and having to wait to read was incredibly frustrating, and I hoped this wouldn't be what I had to do for the rest of my life. He praised my singing, and wrote about how it had helped him and the soldiers as they had cleared the city of the invaders. I think he skipped most of the details, either because he thought he needed to spare me the imagery or because he just didn't feel like writing it out, but even reading about it after the fact, I had anxiety imagining the close-quarter battles on the streets and inside the twisting alleys of the city. Slowly rescuing and gathering pockets of soldiers and guards before pushing towards the harbor where Shaddy lit the enemy's boats on fire and the invaders were killed to the last. The king had survived and had been rescued from his palace that had been under attack by a large force. I was in a room of the palace now. The building was made of stone and hadn't been burned in the slightest. The king had offered to let us rest here and recover, but Suit did not want to wait. The attack had made him nervous and he wanted to get back to the capital as soon as possible. I couldn't really hear or speak, but I could stand, and I have to confess that I was not keen to remain in a city that had just been attacked. I would prefer to be inland and with a small army between me and an attack like that, so I was not hard to convince. Also, the king's priests were busy saving lives and didn't have the time or energy to heal me, but Heza had many priests and high priests. Taros might even have a priest that could help me, so I might not even have to wait to reach Heza. Regardless, if I wanted to be healed I would be best served by moving on. We left as soon as we could, returning to the boats and resuming our journey. It was an interesting and frustrating experience to spend weeks without speaking. The only real kind of entertainment available on the road was conversation. I would have killed for a smartphone, but I suppose the joke would have been on me if I had been able to kill someone to obtain a smartphone, because there wasn't a network for it anyway. That was how bored I was, that I was coming up with nonsense like that. I couldn't even listen to the conversations around me, so the boredom would have been mind-numbing if I hadn't been able to practice with magic. Or rather, if I hadn't been able to practice sensing mana on nudging it around. It really wasn't practicing magic any more than picking up a paintbrush and moving it around a blank canvas without paint was practicing painting. Although, continuing in the vein of my useless, strange, and bored thoughts, it did occur to me that people often took holding things and moving them for granted. Having been a baby thrice, I can tell anyone who asks that grabbing things is hard. The entire time we were traveling to Taros, I was occupied with practicing those skills and making dumb jokes to myself in silence. It wasn't until after we left Taros, the city unfortunately lacked a priest that could heal me, that I finally saw a reward for my effort. Congratulations, you are now level 1 mage. You have learned the skill Minor Mana Sense. You have learned the skill Crude Mana Manipulation. For all its skill was called Minor Mana Sense, it was actually quite a change from my attempts to sense mana before. Whereas I had to try to feel mana before I got the skill, now it was like all my other senses, just a passive part of the way I saw the world around me. It was actually quite distracting, especially because sensing mana involved some minor synesthesia. I could see it in the air, feel it on my skin, and to a lesser extent taste, smell, and even hear it. It was extremely odd, but it also turned my deafness into a benefit, because I seemed to be more sensitive to vibrations traveling through mana as a result. Everyone and every living thing had a small amount of mana in them, and it helped them stand out from the urban environment around them. Shadi, meanwhile, stood out like a bonfire. He seemed to shine when I looked at him, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up when he was nearby. I could see what seemed like half-visible eddies of mana in the air preceding him when he moved and even somewhat hurt him through the mana. This was how I ended up noticing it first, because it created powerful eddies that I could hear I was turning when it burst onto the river bank. The first monster I ever saw looked like someone had taken a dog and crossbred it with a dragon. It was a quadrupedal creature with fur in some places and scales in others. Its face was like a very vicious wolf, maybe 2.5 meters tall at the shoulder and covered in coarse and spiky black fur that transitioned into scales on its neck and body, except for a small strip of fur down its back along its spine until it reached the tail, where it became a bumpy ridge that went down to the tail's tip. The scales were a blackish green and covered the neck and body, and they seemed to flex and overlap as the monster moved. The top tenth of its front legs were scaled as well, but became furred for most of the rest of its length until it reached the monster's front claws, which were also covered in scales. In contrast, the back legs were entirely covered in fur down to its paws. A couple weeks south of here, we would have seen it coming from a mile away. But as we had gone north and climbed in altitude, the environment had changed. The scrub had turned into a grassland, with bushes and trees beside the water, and those had provided it the cover it needed to get this close. At first I thought we were safe, considering that we were on a boat and it was on the shore, but the monster didn't seem to agree. To my horror I saw it preparing to jump, and for a second I wondered if it could possibly cover the distance between itself and us. I couldn't even scream out. My throat no longer hurt, but I was still mute. A second later, it seemed to sprout arrows like pins in a pincushion and fell over dead. The charioteers, who also happened to be consummate archers, began putting their bows away again with a bored look on their faces. I looked wildly from face to face, and no one seemed to care. They just went back to whatever they were doing before. Soot raised an eyebrow at me in question, and I went hunting for the clay I used when I needed to say something. When I found it, I tried to write, but with the adrenaline draining from my body I was starting to shake terribly. I nearly jumped out of my skin in surprise when Soot put his arm around my back to comfort me, but ended up leaning into him and taking some deep breaths. It took a few minutes, but eventually I calmed down enough to write. That was a monster, wasn't it? I wrote, acknowledging it was a kind of obvious question. A wolf drake, Soot wrote in reply. Annoying creatures, they don't even have useful materials and they taste awful. It was the first monster I had seen that wasn't controlled by a tamer of some kind. I thought about the river monsters that were tamed in Rasharan. They had not scared me nearly as much, despite probably being the more dangerous monsters overall. It isn't strange to see monsters here, I read over his shoulder as he wrote. There are chasms only a few days to the east of here. Maybe not quite a week by chariot. Doesn't that make it dangerous to camp on the shore here? I was concerned about sleeping at night with that kind of knowledge. Waking up to a wolf drake standing over me would probably kill me out of terror. Sure, I had fought in my last life, but that had been people, not monsters. Soot's answer was, not particularly. It is very rare for any truly dangerous monster to make it past the forts. Our usual night watch is more than enough to keep us safe. I admit, that sounded like a challenge to the universe, and that I wouldn't have been surprised if a three-headed dark fire-spewing dragon had come out of the clear sky to take the challenge on. However, it never happened. Apparently, there were some monsters sighted and killed by the night watch, but I only ever saw one more personally, one of the horned rabbits, which looked temptingly fluffy. Konamini was a fairly fortified place. There were walls very far out from the city proper that separated the wilderness from farmland, and the farms themselves had piled stone fences dividing them. Even from the river, I was able to see guards patrolling the area as well, although I certainly wouldn't want to live or work on those farms myself. The city proper had another wall, much taller and more fortified than the outer wall. Everything on the ground outside the wall had been raised for 20 feet, leaving nothing that a person or a monster could hide behind. From the information about Kanamini Shadi had written out on the clay, I knew that this city was both a city and a major garrison and supply depot for the nearby forts guarding the chasms. It was a very militarized city, and it showed at the harbor. However, as we went to leave the city, the parts we passed through it became far more residential. Finally, we were on the last leg of the journey, although it was admittedly quite a long leg. The distance between the Rasharan border and Bilos and Agarit and Taros, as well as Taros and Kanamini, were roughly the same, and roughly the same as the distance between Kanamini and Haza. So that meant we only had around 1/5 of the journey left to go. This journey had done nothing to change my mind about travel. This world desperately needs roads and way stations, and I didn't want to travel again until those things existed. Maybe some canals too. We had traveled by boat several times on several different rivers, and it would have been a lot more efficient if they were connected. Well, that might be asking too much. I didn't know anything about building canals, but I bet it was a lot of work, and I had a sneaking suspicion that doing so would cause problems with the water level in the rivers I wanted to connect. No, it would be far better just to stick to roads for now. As I had sworn back in Rasharan, I would have roads built even if I had to fund it myself. Just as soon as I was able to hear and speak again. Timothy had not taken the recommendation to wear sunscreen and sunglasses seriously enough. He had thought, I won't be in the sun long enough for it to matter. I am just walking from the airport to the car picking me up, and from the car to a hotel. If he had a class that granted him increased endurance or vitality, that might have been true. However, a student who recently evolved his class into an archaeologist had very little of either to spare. Archaeologists certainly get some of those stats, but he hadn't had a chance to level it yet. And now, he worried that he might never get that chance, because Timothy learned the hard way that he was one of the lucky few who suffered from devil's itch sunburn. He had come to Kepa to meet with Dr. Karen Smith and to study the ancient ruins of Rasharan that existed throughout the desert, but now Timothy could do nothing but writhe on the floor of his hotel and suffer. How could he meet with Dr. Smith tomorrow morning like this? It was difficult for Timothy to even describe how horrible the feeling was. His worst burns were located in a small area of his neck and shoulders, but it was impossible to ignore. His shoulders itched, and they itched deep. It felt like the itching feeling was under his skin, and he desperately wanted to scratch it despite all the advice that said to not to do so. It wasn't due to his self-control or that advice that stopped Timothy from scratching, though. No, what stopped him was that the first time he tried it had hurt terribly. The itching was so bad he half wanted to stab the location to relieve it, but at the same time he avoided touching the place at all cost because doing so hurt worse than what he imagined being stabbed would normally feel like. It was in desperation that he ended up ordering a potion to be delivered to his hotel room, despite the exorbitant cost of doing so. He had to spend another half an hour in abject misery, but after the potion was delivered and he drank it, Timothy felt a wave of relief that could only be described as pure bliss. Surely, Timothy thought to himself as he finally was able to get into bed without torturing himself. This is what paradise would be like. He was exhausted the next morning, but Timothy felt it was nothing that a liberal application of coffee couldn't cure. He had taken to drinking the stuff by the pot during his time at the university. The competition for this spot on Dr. Smith's team had been brutal, and he had many sleepless nights under his belt. He also made sure to liberally apply sunscreen as well, because last night had been pure hell and he didn't want to pay for a health potion again. He took a taxi to the local museum where Dr. Smith was based, nervously checking his outfit in a haze of caffeine-induced anxiety. To the taxi driver, Timothy might have looked like he was worrying over his appearance for a date rather than for his first meeting with his boss and mentor, but Timothy felt his anxiety was justified. This was the Dr. Karen Smith after all. Dr. Smith was a world-famous archaeologist and historian. A household name that could be heard on the news or read in any textbook on history or magic. Her work had rediscovered lost dungeons, unearthed buried artifacts and hidden relics, and contributed massively to the modern understanding of both the Imperial Confederation and the pre-Confederation era. She was an idol for everyone with a specialized research class, especially ones related to history or archaeology. Dr. Smith had taken a class that was often looked down on as useless and impractical, yet was tolerated because the vast majority of people did realize that history was important, and showed that it could not only produce useful results, but tangible ones too. When they reached the museum, Timothy paid the taxi driver and stepped out, looking at the grand architecture of the building in front of him. The architect had modeled it after ancient Rocheran temples, and the large statuary that stood in the front of the museum gave off an air of imposing majesty. Taking a deep breath and squaring his shoulders, Timothy walked under the reconstructed gaze of pharaohs and gods immortalized in stone into the building proper. There he introduced himself to the receptionist and was told to wait for a few minutes while Dr. Smith sent someone to bring him back into the labs. He watched the crowds while he waited, recalling fond memories when he saw a teacher escorting a group of students on a field trip. One of the doctor's assistants found him a minute later and guided him back into depths of the building, where the public would never see. As much as that conjured images of hidden wonder, Timothy ended up meeting Dr. Karen Smith in an ordinary conference room. The doctor, rather than wearing the stereotypical lab coat of a researcher or the carefully tailored suits that she wore when she appeared on television, was wearing jeans and a t-shirt. She was a short woman with ruddy, tan skin and whose only sign of age was the few streaks of gray in her long black hair that she wore in a loose ponytail. She stood up with a smile and walked over to shake Timothy's hand, greeting him warmly. "Timothy. Welcome." Karen Smith's voice was full of energy, far more than one would expect from a research-type class whose age was in the 80s. "It is wonderful to meet you, your research papers were absolutely inspired." Timothy tried to return her greeting but ended up tongue-tied and stuttering, his face turning red when she laughed merrily at the sight. "I would love to talk more, but there is one thing that we have to do first." The doctor brought out a set of papers. No, the paper was slightly glowing, it was a magical contract. "Please read this carefully and make certain you can accept it before you sign." Timothy accepted the contract and began to read it. At first, he was somewhat flippant about the contract. He certainly wasn't going to get on a plane and leave now that he was already here. Soon though, he noticed that the level of secrecy that the contract bound him to was especially high in the penalties. Death? Timothy blanched. Not even a warning. A slip of the tongue could kill me. Some of the secrets we have dug up over the years aren't the kind of things that can be shared with the public, Dr. Smith said seriously, her tone broking no argument. And we take our secrecy very seriously. There had always been rumors that Dr. Smith had discovered more artifacts and relics than were publicly acknowledged, and that either the doctor or some government had taken some of them because of their power. Timothy had dismissed most of those rumors as conspiracy theories. It was certainly true that there occasionally were artifacts or relics that were more powerful than what modern society could create, but on the whole magical theory had advanced far beyond the ancient civilization's poor understanding. The few items that were superior to their modern equivalents often were things that required cruel and evil methods to produce or use, like human sacrifice. It was incredibly and insanely rare to find something that was both more effective than modern magic and that also was ethically made. Timothy could count all of the artifacts and relics that fit that category with both hands, and could count the ones that were not the result of some unique skill or class on a single hand. As a result, he had never taken the whispers of conspiracy theorists seriously, but in the end, Timothy steeled himself and signed the contract, which burst into motes of light that signified it was a true magical contract. "Wonderful," the doctor said as she smiled. "Now we can talk about why you had to sign that contract and why you were chosen to come here." "I have to admit that I am curious," Timothy said timidly, "although I was under the impression that I was chosen due to my research paper." "Oh, you most certainly were chosen because of your paper," the doctor laughed. "Here, follow me back to our workspace and it might be easier for me to explain and for you to understand." The doctor led Timothy through the halls and into a room filled floor to ceiling with shelves that held plastic bins that contained various artifacts and items that had been bagged and tagged for reference. Navigating through the messy space, Timothy followed Dr. Smith to the back where he could see a stone stela. The stela, it turned out, was their destination, and the doctor merely gestured for Timothy to look at it. Timothy took a step closer and curiously looked at it, only for his brows to furrow immediately. What he saw, and what his skill was telling him, was impossible. I have a skill called age range, Timothy said, nearly struck dumb by what he was looking at. The doctor just nodded. She knew he had the skill because he had said as much on his application. It isn't perfect, but it is telling me that this stela is nearly 4,000 years old. So how? Is this somehow a fake, or is someone tricking my skill somehow? How indeed? The doctor mused, looking over the stela again herself. No, your skill is correct. This stela is somewhere around 3,600 years old and 4,000 years old. I found it myself in a previously unopened tomb that hadn't seen a visitor for just as long. The implications stunned Timothy, because what he saw on the stela, images of airplanes, with a diagram of how wing functioned, a crude description and diagram on how buoyancy worked, an explanation of germ theory and the benefit of sanitation, a very rough description of a motor and electricity, a drawing of what was obviously a modern city and another description of the combustion engine along with warnings about the danger of pollution. Your paper discussing the sudden emergence of new concepts in the Hentai Empire was impressive in many ways. The doctor began to speak as Timothy stood in front of the stela in shock. It was definitely in the top 5 of the papers we received, but it was not the best written of the bunch. Still, your meticulous documentation of publicly available evidence to lend credence to the idea that there was interference from some outside source was excellent. Your analysis of possible sources that the interference could have come from was likewise excellent. With the data available to you, your conclusion that there is a yet undiscovered skill that granted the bearer intuition on possible advances was absolutely perfect. But now that you have seen the stela, what do you think now, Timothy? An oracle or seer of some kind? No, their limitations are well known. Precognition could explain the images of the planes and city, but not the information on germ theory or how planes worked. Timothy's mind began to whirl, and despite his groaning about his low endurance and vitality last night, he was now incredibly happy with his 200+ acuity stat. Godly interference? But their limitations were even more strict until the descent. It can't be a unique skill either, there is too much and too little information for that, so a visitor of some kind. But from where? Another plane? The Fae don't use technology, elementals can't comprehend technology, and celestials are restricted from giving information that isn't known by at least one living person. Not another plane then, but it certainly isn't alien life either. Any creature that could reach the planet across the void of space has a grasp of magic or technology that far outstrips the information on this stela. The more he thought about it, the more impossible this seemed. It would make far more sense if Timothy had passed out in the hotel and was dreaming all of this. Your thinking and reasoning is quite sound, Dr. Smith assured him. Which shows that I was right to choose you. Regardless, whatever you decide is as valid as anyone else's opinion here, because I cannot tell you how the information on this stela found its way onto the stone all those millennia ago. I have my own theories, but I have yet to find any evidence one way or another. Where was this found? Timothy asked, stumbling back into a chair as the shock caught up with him. Inside the tomb of Princess Hometra, Dr. Karen Smith answered with a smile. Chapter 21 There are not only many gods in the world, but many kinds of gods. First, there are the primordial. Primordial gods are those that existed first. Creators and builders which are responsible for the existence of the planes. We know nothing about where the primordials came from, but we do know that there was nothing here before them. More precisely, there was no here at all. They made the universe, the planes, and the major gods, but we know precious little about them, because they left for elsewhere. Despite the reverence they are held in, the primordials are not truly worshipped and answer no prayers. The major gods were created directly by the primordials to maintain the world. Major gods are naturally powerful, requiring no external power to fuel their actions and blessings. However, all major gods are tied to a single concept or a specific set of rules each and will rarely act outside of their domain. It is just as rare that they will empower priests, because they care little for prayer and worship. Minor gods are a diverse bunch, containing several subcategories. Broadly though, they can be divided into two main groups, the Ascended and the Faith-born. Ascended are the rarer of the two, consisting of mortals who have shed their mortality and transcended their shells to become minor gods themselves. Like the major gods, they have their own power and require no external power to maintain themselves. Ascended require no worshippers to exist, but they often gather worshippers to expand their power and influence. Faith-born minor gods, in contrast, rely on their worshippers for their very existence. They are born from the faith of their worshippers, literally coming into existence as a result of being prayed to even when they didn't exist. There are a countless amount of faith-born, but the vast majority are relatively weak. When you hear a tale of a high-leveled individual facing down a god, they're almost always fighting a faith-born. Although it is worth noting that only the highest-level individuals armed with powerful armor and weapons can do such a thing. Only a legend among legends can fight even the weakest of gods. While the vast majority of faith-born are weak, the minority of strong faith-born are incredibly powerful. Some faith-born, particularly those that are worshipped by a large congregation for millennia, reach a state of immortality where even the elimination of their worshippers can no longer kill them. The pantheons of Resharan and the Mica kingdoms are a prime example of this. Even now, where their worshippers have dwindled to mere cults, they maintain the ability to bless their most devoted followers with incredible power. Even more incredibly, a few faith-born have even reached a level of power that they were able to challenge the major gods and win. The War of the Gods occurred soon after the descent and lasted several centuries as some of the most powerful faith-born fought the major gods for dominance. This war shook the Imperial Confederation to its core as the institutions of faith within the Confederation became a destabilizing factor for the empires. An excerpt from The Many Gods of Humanity by Cardinal Alexei Ricardo. Hazel was not very impressive, to be honest, not compared to the cities of Resharan. Still, it certainly was a large city and a welcome sight for my weary eyes for a multitude of reasons. When we had left Kuwa, we had sent a messenger ahead of us, so our arrival was anticipated. I would be visiting the temples and the high priests to be healed before going to meet Suit's family, which was also my family now. And I'd thought that, counting Suit's family, I've had 4 families over 3 lives. I even had a good relationship with my first and second, and that thought was not just odd but also worrying. It feels wrong to group the families I've had into good and bad as if they were days. A family was not supposed to be just a tally in a column, but perhaps thinking that way would be an inevitable result of my existence. The pessimism I was feeling was likely because of my anxiety about meeting my husband's family. Meeting my first boyfriend's family was bad enough and it had nowhere near the same kind of consequences for my life. Of course, on the other hand, it wasn't like any consequence had real weight either. Being, well, not immortal, I have died too often to be called immortal, which is saying something considered I've only existed for a bit over 50 years in total, but eternal. Every negative experience would lose their value as well. If I was thrown into a prison and tortured until death, it would be terrible, but in 10,000 years would I even recall the event? Wow, I was cynical today. Probably because this life and my last life had me dealing with people who could have me killed without much thought about it. A maid dealing with nobles could be tossed aside like trash at any time, and the daughter of a baron was hardly capable of protecting a mere maid from someone like a duke or a marquis. In this life, my brothers and sisters also could have pulled off killing me if I had misstepped, and by hentai laws my life was very much in Suit's hands right now. I hope in my next life I am reincarnated into a world where the consequence of being rude to someone is something more proportional. It would be nice if I didn't have to worry about a headsman or a poisoned dagger in the back, but instead just have to deal with whomever I offended calling me an asshole. I was lost in my thoughts for a while as we went through the market. There really wasn't much to look at here because impressive architecture and art was reserved for the nobility, priesthood, and particularly rich merchants. The vast majority of everyone else had what amounted to huts, with the only real difference between any one city and another being the materials that the huts were made out of. Or so I had thought, but an item in a stall caught my eye. It was, I suppose, a near worthless item in this market, with no real value except its rarity. Because to a Bronze Age civilization, what was iron but an ugly and useless metal? It was brittle, it rusted, it was hard to work and expensive to heat. Iron was simply not worth the effort to mine it. No one had even known what I was talking about when I had first tried to ask about it as a child, and to be honest I had forgotten about it as time went on, but I could recognize it on sight. I got Suit to stop the chariot and excitedly jumped out to see the merchant. Of course, I can't actually hear or speak right now, which makes explaining my actions a pain in the ass and also makes purchasing anything just as big a problem. I can't tell him what I want and he can't tell me the price. The poor man looked terrified actually. He looked like just a simple trader, with a rough wooden cart and some assorted low-value wares. Being approached by an obvious noble riding in a chariot with a nobleman, after guards had cleared the way, announcing the presence of the first prince, nearly drove him into a panic. I couldn't even say anything to calm him down. I was just a silently smiling noblewoman approaching him excitedly, which even I admit is kind of creepy. I didn't bother to try miming or explaining, instead I merely removed one of my rings, a golden piece with small rubies, and tossed it to the trader, who fumbled and very nearly dropped it, and I grabbed the iron bauble. I cheerily went back to the chariot while getting amused looks from Suit. He probably thought I was just interested in something unique and that the iron amulet had caught my eye for that reason, but here was something practical I could do to improve the world around me. While it is true that I can only wish I had paid better attention in my history and chemistry classes all those decades and lives ago, I had some very basic knowledge from my first world that no one else had in this one. I knew that iron was the main ingredient in steel. I was fairly certain that the other ingredient was carbon, and I kind of knew how charcoal was made. I think. I was pretty sure that you just had to heat wood without burning it to make charcoal, and while that was an issue in Risharon, there were actually forests near Heza. Sure, there were quite a few kinks to work out, but even if I wasn't very knowledgeable about the process I certainly knew enough to grab a dozen miners and smiths and start them experimenting. I mean, how hard could it actually be? People figured out how to make steel before they figured out that shitting in the same water you drank was a bad idea, so it should be easy enough. There was a reason that I was so particular in what I drank when I could be. I had Ion Sir use a tool from an alchemist called a retort to purify the water I drank. Well, actually I was even more careful than that. I had alcohol added to the water first, then simmered to boil off the alcohol, and then ran through the retort to leave the water as pure and clean as possible. The point here is, that I am confident that I can figure this out, or that I can hire some people to figure it out anyway. I was lost in my fantastical daydreams of revolutionizing society and have working toilets when we reached the temple. Hentai priests were a weird bunch in my opinion. Most of my 3 lives had been spent in places where religion was fairly organized and centralized, but the hentai worshipped dozens or hundreds of gods. Every random village seemed to have their own weather or storm god, and the empire had priests and shamans scattered pretty much everywhere. Personally, I believed there was a link to the disorganization of the hentai religion and the relative weakness of their priests. After all, you can hardly have a high priest without having other priests for them to be high over. So it would stand to reason that the larger a religion was, and the more priests it had, the more high priests it would be able to maintain. At least, that is my theory anyway. This disorganization is also reflected in the temple's construction. It was unimpressive. By comparison, anyway. The grandeur of Rasharan is perhaps an unfair comparison, though, because the grand workings of Rasharan are impressive even by the standards of Earth. Sure, the modern society I lived in could build skyscrapers, but that was a fairly recent development. Prior to those there were few places that could match Rasharan, and all of the places that could were well known. The building was made of piled stone, not even properly cut blocks. There were statues and decorations, but they were rather few and far between. The temple seemed rather drab to me. Maybe it would look better with flowers and greenery? That might go along well with the piled stone style, making it look more natural. It seemed my thoughts had wandered again, because I hadn't even noticed the group of priests that had come to greet Soot and myself. I blame my inattention on my deafness. Without anything to listen to, it becomes really easy for me to get lost in my own head. Hopefully, that will be done with soon. An older man came up to me and seemed to greet me happily. He had a smile on his face, somewhat covered by his gray beard, and from the colorful designs on his robes, and the situation I was meeting him in, it was easy to guess he was a priest. Possibly the high priest himself. That would make sense considering that I was visiting with the first prince, and that the first prince was my husband. Actually, when the old priest leaned in close and put his hands over my ears, my initial reaction, quickly suppressed, was to pull myself back and push him away. I mean, sure, I was here to be healed, but it wasn't like he warned me. Admittedly, he couldn't have if he wanted to, though. His lips moved, and I guessed he was saying a prayer when his eyes glowed, and then, "And bless this woman with your healing, praise to you in the heavens above." I was able to hear the high priest finishing his prayer, and the bustle of the city around me. I was healed. "Thank you," I said, finally able to speak again as well, and bowed to the high priest. "I am incredibly grateful for your help. I was worried that I would be stuck in silence forever." "There is no need to thank me, princess," the old high priest gestured for me to stop bowing. "I merely channeled the will of the goddess Kamarsipa, and she granted me the ability to heal you. Then please, allow me to thank the goddess. I mean, to a certain degree I was nervous about interacting with religion. Getting the attention of a capricious non-human entity of vast power seemed like a bad idea, and I was somewhat worried that they could somehow find a way to stop me from returning to Poti. On the other hand, I certainly was grateful that I could speak and hear again. Should I make an offering? I apologize that I am not entirely familiar with the gods of your lands. I wonder if anyone is. They have so many gods that I wouldn't believe anyone who told me they actually knew them all. Someone should catalog them and make a single temple for all the different storm and weather gods. After all, they all do fundamentally the same thing, right? If they worked together they would be far more effective, I would think, although I have no idea what the gods are actually like. If you truly desire to do so, it is traditional to sacrifice a ram when thanking Kamarsipa, the high priest recommended. You do not need to wield the blade yourself, although that would be for the best. I would rather not kill an animal if I could help it. I mean, I had killed people in the previous life, but this life was different, and there is something about killing animals. I guess, on reflection, that it is not about whether what I am killing is animal or human, but rather how innocent whatever I am killing is. I don't think I could kill a loving mother of 3, but I could kill an assassin. No, high priest, so long as I can be guided into doing it correctly, I will wield the knife myself. At least that way I can kill it as humanely as possible. I wouldn't be doing the sacrifice now, but I should do it soon. For now though, we had to go to the palace. I still had to meet my father-in-law and mother-in-law, as well as my husband's other wife. My anxiety had returned in full force now that I didn't have much to distract me, or I didn't until Soot pulled me into a one-armed hug as he drove our chariot towards the palace. "I'm relieved that you can hear again, Hem," he said with a smile. "I was worried that they wouldn't be able to help you." "I am relieved to be able to communicate properly again," I agreed emphatically. It was intensely frustrating, especially when I had questions and no way to ask them. It isn't like I can properly write while bouncing around in a chariot, or that you could read what I wrote while driving one. Soot laughed, saying, "Well, I have a question for you first. Why did you get so excited buying that trinket earlier? It is a symbol of a northeaster weather god, I think, and it isn't nearly worth the ring you traded for it. Because it is iron, I didn't know the word for iron and ended up using the English word for it. You have no idea what can be done with this metal. Iron is the gateway to a whole new world of possibilities. Iron? Suit asked in confusion. Do you mean iron? It is nearly worthless because of its fragility. What would you use it for? Iron. I tried out the hentai word for it, before explaining. It is fragile because you are forging it wrong. Properly made, iron is stronger than bronze, but I am not interested in that really. No, I want to make steel. Same deal? Suit quirked an eyebrow at me. I've never heard of that before. Is it something you had in Rasharan? Oh no, I shook my head immediately. Steel requires iron to make, like bronze requires copper, and we had no iron sources in Rasharan. Bronze is made from copper and tin, while steel is made from iron and carbon. Steel is many times stronger than bronze, and if it is made properly it does not rust as iron does. Admittedly, I have no idea how to make it so that it doesn't rust, but one step at a time, right? So if Rasharan has neither iron or steel, he asked slowly as the chariot pulled up in front of the palace. Where did you learn of it? Oops. I was too excited about finding iron and being able to talk again. Thankfully, a group from the palace was coming to greet us because I had no idea how to explain this one. I could only hope Suit would forget, but I doubt he would. My work to create steel would remind him even if he did forget. Chapter 22. Of course the people don't want war. But after all, it's the leaders of the country who determine the policy, and it's always a simple matter to drag the people along whether it's a democracy, a fascist dictatorship, or a parliament, or a communist dictatorship. Voice or no voice, the people can always be brought to the bidding of the leaders. That is easy. All you have to do is tell them they are being attacked, and denounce the pacifists for lack of patriotism, and exposing the country to greater danger. Hermann Göring, Nazi Reichsmarshal and Luftwaffe chief speaking to American psychologist Gustav E. Gilbert during the Nuremberg trials. The hentai were less formal than I was used to, or perhaps I was just unfamiliar with the etiquette of my new empire. When Suit's first wife greeted him, it was more of a leaping tackle hug than anything else. He had the physical stats to catch her easily, but Suit did that little spin with her in his arms that you see in movies where this kind of thing happens, because before this moment I had never thought that people actually did this. Of course, there was no way Suit could know that his movements were a cliché from a different world, and I was reasonably certain that his movements were practical. With Suit's stats, he might as well be a brick wall. If he hadn't done that little spin to reduce her momentum, the woman might have hurt herself with that move. Regardless, the whole scene was very strange to me and I wasn't sure how to react. I suppose, in the back of my head, I had always imagined a sort of distance between them. Not that I expected Suit to treat myself better than her. On the contrary, I imagined that I would be treated with the same distance when I was no longer new and interesting, so to speak. To be honest, the potential for real closeness kind of spooked me. Sure, I had imagined that it would be possible for me to fall in love with Prince Suit, but love is quite a loose word in a lot of ways. What I had hoped for was essentially a professional relationship that evolved into mild affection and then over time into a kind of gentle intimacy. What I was looking at reminded me more of a head-over-heels love that you would see in a romance movie. Or maybe I was looking at this all wrong, and Suit's first marriage wasn't political and I was intruding on a perfectly loving relationship. Would it even be seen as intruding? Polygamy was more common among the hentai than in Rasharan, and as first prince, Suit would be expected to have multiple wives. Princess Hemmer, Suit began to introduce his first wife to me formally after he set her down. Allow me to introduce my first wife, Princess Malnia of Amor. Seeming to discard formality immediately, Malnia then walks over and hugs me saying, "It is good to meet you, sister, I hope we can get along well." "It is certainly good to meet you too, and I very much hope the same," I reply, but I am bewildered by her behavior. Even as I am replying, she is already half dragging me into the palace. She has been traveling for over a month. Malnia was scolding Sut as she guided me towards what I presumed were the baths. Of course she needs time to be ready to meet your father. No woman would dare offend the emperor by coming uncovered from the dust of the road. Well, she isn't exactly wrong, I suppose. And a bath would feel absolutely wonderful right now, so I tell I and Sir to unload, at least enough for me to get dressed after the bath, and to meet me at the baths. Malnia left one of her servants to guide them after us even as she pulled me onwards. While she was doing this, I took the time to examine her. Princess Malnia was a short woman with slightly paler skin than my own and was maybe a few years older than me. She had long, slightly curly, hair that ended just below her shoulders and wore a colorful dress that was decorated in much the same way as Sut's robes. Malnia was very pretty, but she also seemed rather agitated. As if her happy and energetic behavior was just a mask for what she was really feeling. I turned out to be correct about that, because once we were out of sight her face morphed into a determined and aggressive glare. Malnia rounded on me, scowling and suspicious and speaking in a clipped tone. "I am going to be Prince Sut's queen," she announced in a hiss. "Not you." "So if you think I have no interest in becoming queen," I interrupt her, deciding to skip the threats. "I also have no intention to put my children forward as a candidate for emperor." Taken aback by my sudden announcement, she scrutinized my face intently. Her eyes narrowed and her lips pursed as she searched my face for any hint that I was lying. All she would find is unsurprised exhaustion though. I was expecting a conversation like this eventually, although admittedly not so soon. The messengers wouldn't have carried much information about me, I suppose. I start talking to fill the silence. But I have no real interest in politics or status, and I do not want to fight. I am fine acknowledging you as Sut's first wife and future queen, even publicly if you want. You aren't lying. Malnia's reply was a statement, not a question. I wonder if she had a skill that could detect lies. I imagine most royalty and nobles did have a skill like that. You truly have no desire to become queen? None? Why should I? To a certain extent, this discussion amuses me. While I could understand why my siblings back in Rasharan might think I would want to become pharaoh, with the perspective I have it is difficult to understand why anyone would want to be queen in my position. Malnia looks like she doesn't quite understand the question, so I expand upon my thoughts. What would I gain from becoming queen? A rhetorical question. I already know the answer. Wealth. As queen or princess, my wealth is exactly the same, whatever Sut decides to give me. Power. All power is vested in the emperor, so when Sut takes the throne his queen won't actually gain power unless he gives that power to her. And the last thing I want is for any child of mine to get involved in the battle for political power. I don't want to find a son dead from poisoned wine or a daughter bartered away for political favors. I've seen too much of that in my former home already. Anyway, the political rankling would keep me away from other projects. I see. Malnia seemed somewhat lost. I guess she had been building herself up for some kind of fight since she had known I existed. She probably wasn't even sure what to do now. So about that bath. Asterisk. I met with the emperor, but honestly he didn't seem to care much about me or even really be slightly interested in talking to me. Sut's brothers, the other princes, were, but their interest was exactly the wrong kind. I would have to watch my interactions with them and it would probably be better not to do so at all. Anyway, as far as the emperor was concerned, I was the receipt for the new peace treaty. Which, to be fair, I was. There were far more important issues for him to deal with, namely the attack on Agarit. They had not been the only attack. Reports from towns and cities up and down the coast told tales of unknown sales and raids. Messengers had come from the Mica kingdoms warning of cities burning. Refugees had not reached the Hittite borders yet, but it was only a matter of time. At the same time, the chasms of hell were unusually active and monsters were crawling out of them more and more every month. Food from Rasharan would mitigate some of the issues, but the Hittite Empire was essentially preparing to fight a war on two fronts. Maybe it would be better to call it two separate wars, or even a war and a natural disaster. In both cases it was an attritional battle, which the empire could least afford. Thankfully, the emperor was able to redistribute soldiers from the Rasharan border to other locations, but that wouldn't be enough. Being at the emperor's court was a sobering experience. The Hittite had none of the stability of Rasharan. Thank you for meeting me. I spoke to the 24 or so men who had gathered to hear me speak. I am sure you are all very busy, so I won't take up much of your time. If you have any questions during this meeting, feel free to ask. Don't worry about social status. Well, if that is the way you want it. One man spoke up to the incredulity of the people around him, who clearly were not about to speak up to someone of such higher status. You should know none of us are busy. We can't do anything without metal to work. Soot was humoring me by allowing me to do this, gathering bronze workers for my steel project, and I doubt he believed my claims about steel at all. However, it was just as true that there was a metal shortage, so what would be the harm in letting me borrow them? This meeting will address that, I say, holding up the iron trinket I had bought last week when I arrived here in Hazel last week. I am sure you know what this is, and I am sure you are aware that with your current methods that it is weaker than bronze. However, much like copper can be made into bronze with tin, iron can be made into a far stronger substance by adding charcoal. I am aware that many consider iron to be borderline unworkable because of its high melting point, I said. Although if I was honest I had only become aware of it a few days ago and had just managed to throw together a hodgepodge solution yesterday. But that is a problem I believe we can surmount by using certain techniques from my homeland. Is that a lie? I guess it depends on if Rasharan or Earth counts as my homeland. So what do you need us for? The man from earlier asked. If everything was going fine you would be commandeering everyone in the city. What is the catch? I know iron and charcoal can be used to make steel, I answered. However, I have no clue what the ratio is. That got a groan from the whole room. The exact mix of tin and copper varied from bronze worker to bronze worker depending on what they knew and what they had on hand, but everyone was aware that the ratio was critically important. A small change in the amount of tin would make a massive difference in the quality of the bronze. I know. I use my skills to placate them slightly. However, if made correctly, steel is several times stronger than bronze, and iron is a far sight easier to source than either copper or tin. I will need you to help me make steel for the first time. Switch them, I ordered with a hint of exasperation in my voice. But my family has. The farmer angrily tried to interrupt only to be struck across the face and sent to the ground by my new guards. I will explain this one more time, because I am a generally nice person. I let my anger resonate in my voice and instill fear in the idiot arguing with me, but I do not need your agreement for this. It is an order from the royal, and your place is to obey it. He alternated between cowering from my guard and sneaking glares at me, which very nearly earned him a kick in the head from my guard before I signaled him to stop. Considering that I had decided to recruit my guards from the refugees that were just starting to arrive, the men tended to be both very grateful and have very few compunctions about using violence. I was happy about the first bit, but the last was a work in progress. It was useful at times though. As you well know, I said after gathering my thoughts. I am from Rasharan. I am sure you have heard the legends of the abundance along the banks of Sharanan, which flows through the empire granting life to the entire land. What few know is that Sharanan does more for us than simply irrigate our fields and provide water for our thirst. It floods regularly every year, and when it does so it rejuvenates our soil and blesses it so that it may produce food for us again. Because when you grow your crops, you take from the ground, and while Sharanan returns what the earth needs for life back to it, nothing does so here. You complain about my demand that you change where your family has farmed for generations, but that is exactly the problem. You have taken and taken from the soil without ever returning to it. All I wanted him to do was switch where his fucking goats grazed and his crops were grown for a year. Was that so hard to ask? Apparently it was a lot of work. I wouldn't know, I have never farmed, but the leading edge of refugees from the Mica kingdoms were reaching us now, with tales of more to come. The one thing we wouldn't lack was hands to work the land unless we couldn't feed them. The Mica refugees told a daunting and unpleasant tale. Raiders from the sea attacking the trade cities and palaces of the coast and invasion on land from the Durs that lived further north were exacerbating a drought. The same sea raiders were also interrupting trade by sea, so a famine was expected to occur in the region and become worse over the next few years. Introducing the most basic form of crop rotation, the only one I could put together from memory, would help, although I was not sure it would be enough. If I could remember the more advanced forms of crop rotation I would be more confident, but I would have to work with what I had. ****. Orphanages and homeless shelters are a must, I argued with the priest. And the temples are the best choice to set them up. But the cost? The priest whined, shrinking back as my skills overwhelmed him. The priests were well aware of how my skills worked, but with my charisma being so high only the high priest could actually resist them. As a result, when I came to talk I usually ended up talking to whichever priest was in disfavor that particular day. What cost? I barely prevent myself from a very unprincess-like snort. We have food right now, but the future isn't known. What we can predict though, is that refugees and war orphans will be increasing. We might as well use the extra labor to create places for them to live, if for no other reason than to keep an eye on them. Here is what we do, I say, slightly starting to hate myself for this. We provide the families a place to live and food to eat while we can, as poor a place to sleep as it might be, and even though it is just enough food to avoid starvation. If these attacks intensify, we decry the situation and make them afraid of losing what little they have left. They were refugees previously, they will know how bad it is to be without shelter and to be hungry. So we whip them up into a frenzy, and promise the men that we will take care of the families of any man who volunteers for war. We reduce the resources for the ones that don't volunteer and give them to the people who do, and insinuate the ones who don't volunteer are cowardly and might even be working with the enemy. We acknowledge that we cannot arm them properly, but say that we refuse to send them into battle unarmed. Our ancestors used stone and so will we, arming them with stone axes and clubs. We have to make sure to arm some of them with metal to make them feel like we are trying, but at the end of the day we will have a fanatical force willing to die for us to use as shock troops. In other words, I am sending off the refugees to die horribly on the claws of monsters or to the weapons of the far better equipped and supplied raiders, all to give an advantage to the main hentai troops. We get more troops in the field, less mouths to feed at home, less malcontents in our cities, and at the end of the day they thank us for it because we assure that their loved ones are safe. And these schools you want to create? The beleaguered priest looks over my written proposal. This is also inexpensive. Are you a priest or a miser? The cost will be worth it, believe me. We can't just let the children run around without supervision, and this will provide the perfect opportunity to have them take in our culture and philosophy. More importantly, we can teach them the classes we want and have a supply of whatever kind of worker we need whenever we need them. As much as my ideas make sense, I can't help but think that if my plan is taking inspiration from the Nazis, I must have done something wrong somewhere. Next time I died I was going to take a long look at the memory-related abilities. If I could remember everything I was taught, I am sure I would be able to come up with better solutions than this. Chapter 23. By the time a year had passed since I had arrived in Hazel, things were far worse and were unlikely to get better for a long time. I had greatly underestimated the amount of refugees that would be coming south, as well as the difficulty of the projects I was working on. Hell, I had underestimated the difficulty of merely communicating with the refugees. I, as a royal and a former scribe, was well educated and spoke multiple languages, but I was the exception and not the rule. The vast majority of the population spoke In, while the refugees spoke Mican, and anyone who could speak both was in high demand. The schools I had founded were helping to teach Hindi to the refugees, but it was only in Haza and only for a fraction of the refugees. To make matters worse, the coast had become far more volatile. My plan to turn the refugees into soldiers and guards certainly helped hold the major cities on the coast, but every few months news came of another minor city or town burned to the ground. Moreover, the casualties among the refugees were brutal and their morale was dropping fast. Concerns were raised about the potential for the refugee troops to mutiny, and the generals were of the opinion that it was not a matter of if they mutiny but of when they mutiny. Many of the refugees were starting to suspect they were being sent out to die, and they weren't even wrong in thinking that. I had hoped to allay their fears and increase their effectiveness by giving them old bronze armor and weapons from our army as we replaced bronze with steel, but the development of steel was progressing far slower than I anticipated. I had thought that steel would be fairly easy to develop. I knew the ingredients, even if I didn't know the ratio, so all that should need to be done is to create 100 batches of an iron and carbon mix, each one with 1% more iron and less carbon, and then test the results to find the strongest. Actually, it was even easier than that, because I knew that steel was mostly iron. So only 8-9 batches would need to be made, starting from 51% iron and progressing to 99% iron. However, creating a process for purifying iron and removing waste metals from the ore turned out to be far more involved than I had imagined. First, the iron ore had to be run through a blow-omery, which was more or less just an oven. The entirety of my contribution to that effort was explaining, badly, how to make bellows. However, the bellows were what allowed iron to be smelted in the first place, otherwise the blow-omery simply wouldn't be hot enough. So after that, the end result was a mix of iron and slag. The second thing you had to do was take the entire mess, heat it up, and then beat it to remove the slag. It was only after doing this that the third step could be taken, which was sealing the iron in clay with charcoal in an attempt to make steel. The entire process took far longer and was far more labor-intensive than I had thought it would be, although progress was certainly being made. The last batch had been reported to be about as strong as bronze, and I had high hopes that they would produce real steel within the next month. That wasn't to say that their work had not been useful yet. Making bronze required copper and tin, the former of which was not available in all regions, and the latter of which was actually fairly rare. We had our own source of tin here in Hentai, but it wasn't enough to meet demand for bronze, and both we and Rasharan relied on trade to obtain the tin we needed. However, that trade went through the mica kingdoms, which were in various states of collapse. As a result, replacing bronze weapons and tools was becoming far more difficult, and bronze was used pretty much everywhere in society. It was becoming difficult to obtain copper as well, as much of the Hentai supply came from a large island offshore, and the sea raiders were choking shipments from the island. If farmers had to return to using stone and wooden tools, our food problems would become far worse, especially since this would affect Rasharan as well. Before we attempted to turn it to steel, iron in the second step could be wrought into all kinds of tools. It wasn't as strong as bronze, but wrought iron was far more available, and the nobility was working to increase the production of wrought iron even as bronze production was falling. Discussions were already taking place on the topic of exporting iron tools to Rasharan, as they were also likely suffering a bronze shortage. I was pushing for the tools to be sent for free or nearly free, despite the fact that Rasharan could certainly pay in gold. There were a number of reasons for this, not the least of which was signaling to my family back in Rasharan that I was loyally on their side, because appearing to be that way would be very useful in any future negotiations. The Hentai took the implication that they owed me, and Rasharan, for the information I was giving them rather well. Far better than I thought they would. Eventually, I found out that it was not just because of the support of Sut, but also because of Malnia's support. Her homeland was also suffering from the bronze shortage, although it was far more stable than we were. Essentially, we would be trading iron to Rasharan and Amor in return for food and reinforcements respectively. At least, that was what was going on above the surface, but below the surface, well, who was to say those reinforcements from Amor would pull all the way back whenever this chaos ended? The chasms prevented them from grabbing much land, but the leverage a Moor could gain from having a foothold to potentially expand from could be used in many different ways. On the other side, if Rasharan found its own source of iron, well, they could be an island unto themselves then. Rasharan agriculture supplied the world even before the Hittite trade deal, mostly fueled by Rasharan's hunger for tin. Now, iron would replace tin, but if Rasharan had their own source they would not need to trade their food at all. The change in the balance of trade had implications that no one could foresee. Admittedly, most of my work had effects I couldn't foresee. I certainly hadn't predicted that my offhand attempt to make sense of the myriad gods that were scattered throughout Hittite lands would result in the creation of a new grand temple, that wasn't near finished, dedicated to the worship of the storm and weather gods of the region as a whole. The whole, gods are real, thing was difficult for me to comprehend and deal with in the first place. The fact that they, and by extension, their priests, could actually affect the weather had meant that they were critically important to agriculture in the empire. However, I was aware that you couldn't just change the weather in one place without affecting an entire region. Furthermore, I knew that these local gods and their priests were rather weak because they only had a few worshippers each, even if their total number was huge between all of them. All I had wanted to do was to get the priests of all of those gods to coordinate so that we could have weather more conducive to agriculture while taking less energy to do so. Somehow, that had snowballed into the creation of a council of the priests, and from that into the council of the storm gods themselves. A couple of offhand comments about weather, climate, and the water cycle later, and I had somehow landed myself with a skill called Blessings of the Storm Gods, bestowed upon me by those gods. The skill increased my affinity with water and air by a lot, however it also reduced my affinity with fire and earth by an equal amount. Apparently, it increased my mana regeneration as well, but honestly that didn't matter much because the closest thing I had to a magic teacher was Shouty, and he was most familiar with fire. That blessing was the first time I had even heard about the elements of mana because I never had any time to train my use of magic and I could barely throw out what Shouty called a magic missile. Actually learning how to use the elements was far beyond my current skill level, and now Shouty wouldn't even be able to teach me anything but the utter basics. I couldn't even politely refuse, because I was too afraid to even hint that I was unhappy with a group of beings that could smite me with an errant thought. Thinking of magic, my introduction to sensing mana and the schools I had founded also had unexpected effects. Well, they weren't unexpected for me. I was fully aware that odd things would happen if I tried to introduce magic on a large scale. For one thing, the students did not get the mage class, rather they got the skills for minor mana sense and crude mana manipulation as part of the student class. More importantly, nearly all of the students were adults who had leveled their main class quite a bit or had multiple classes, and learning magic had resulted in new skills popping up. A soldier had gained the skill Infuse Weapon, which allowed him to push his mana into his weapon, making it stronger and sharper. A miner had learned Vein Sense, which allowed him to send out a pulse of mana that would cause concentrations of metals to shine in his vision, even through the ground. If anything, I was more surprised by the rarity of these skills than their existence. I could not, for the life of me, understand why one soldier gained the skill Infuse Weapon, another one learned the skill Infuse Armor, and another 24 soldiers gained no special skills at all. Neither skill was needed in the classroom, and both of them had wanted skills that would protect them from injury. In the end, the special skills that some people learned when they found out how to sense and manipulate mana were too rare to matter much. Maybe 2% of the population gained a skill, and few of them could be called world-shatteringly important because no one had enough mana to make good use of them. My plan to expand the Hittite body of knowledge regarding magic was a simple one. If everyone could sense and manipulate mana at a basic level, by sheer strength of the numbers some would take the next step and the next step beyond that. It was an undeniably crude method, but mages were few and far between, and most were priests first. As for my other projects, Road building was stalled because of issues delivering food to the worksites, which is exactly the kind of problem the roads were being built to solve. It almost felt like we needed roads to build roads. Soot also axed the way station idea, citing the possibility for bandits or raiders to use them. Soot was doing most of the ruling in the empire right now, which was how I was able to get most of my projects moving in the first place. His father, the emperor, was sick, and it was the worst time for that. If there were any issues during the succession, it could tear the empire apart and burn it to the ground. Maintaining central authority during the chaos was a must. There was happy news though. 7 months after I arrived in Haza, Malnia had given birth to a healthy baby boy. As strange as it was to have a stepson, it was definitely something to celebrate. Mother and infant mortality was horrifically high in this world, and even though Malnia had received the best care available, that had not amounted to much at all. However, with the Emperor second Soot looking more and more like he was going to take the throne soon, Soot having an heir born to him already was seen as a good sign. Obviously, his son would not be ready to take the throne himself for a long time, but the existence of an heir was still a guarantee of stability to the masses. Plus, little Arnie was cute. Who doesn't love a baby that you don't have to take care of personally? All the cuteness and none of the work. It was good to remember that even in trying times like these, there was joy and humor to be found. The hentai had a fairly dark sense of humor, the Emperor especially as his health failed. Actually, the Emperor had become far more relaxed as he had come closer to death, and Soot took up more of the ruling of the empire, cracking dark and sometimes bawdy jokes whenever he felt like it. It would be difficult to articulate how embarrassing it was for me to hear my husband and my father-in-law, who also happened to be future ruler and the current ruler of the country respectively, joking that my father-in-law's death and my husband's subsequent coronation would be the best time to convince Malnia and myself into a threesome. Both Malnia and I had been too embarrassed to eat dinner with the Emperor for weeks after that. *****. Now, I was waiting to see the latest attempt by my smiths to create steel. I was very hopeful for this one, and so were the other smiths I was working with. The introduction of wrought iron had led to metal armor becoming more available to the average soldier, and my smiths were interested in trying it with the much stronger steel. I could almost see the visions of invincible warriors striding through a battle whenever they got a faraway look in their eyes. Princess. Smith calls out to me, I think we have it. Steel. Well, let's begin the test then. I say with a smile, this could be a revolutionary moment for our empire. The tests we were doing were not very sophisticated. It really just amounted to, make a bar out of the metal and then whack it against stuff until it breaks. If you knew how fast a bronze bar would break under those conditions, and a different metal lasted longer, it was the stronger of the two. It was horribly imperfect, but it was what we had. Either way, the test of the newest material that I was watching was simply the lead smith smashing a bar against a rock. He was trying his best to break it, and he was not succeeding, which was perfect. The man's strength stat was over 200. He was one of the strongest men in the empire. And he still was unable to break the bar. I was so excited I could jump for joy, but instead I held my stomach, turned to the side and threw up. I had no idea where the sudden nausea had come from until a thought struck me. Even as the smiths were worrying around me, I was ignoring them as I counted. It wasn't exactly easy to be regular in a civilization with this level of technology. Health was hardly understood here at all. However, I was far further overdue than I should be, and that could mean that I was pregnant. Tobe continued. Thanks for listening.